Welcome everybody to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events and issues. The events we're analyzing today are the Great Depression and the New Deal. The New Deal was the program by President Franklin Roosevelt, often called FDR, to combat the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a severe worldwide economic crisis that started in 1929 and lasted throughout the 1930s. Around the world, there was widespread unemployment, poverty, closing of businesses, people losing their homes, and people starving. Throughout history, there had been recessions. In the early part of the U.S., they were sometimes called panics. What made this economic crisis different were its severity and duration. What caused the Great Depression? Economists and historians have been fighting over this question since the 1930s. Although there are arguments about specific details, there are some generalities that are commonly accepted. Throughout American history, a recession has occurred when there's not enough demand for all of the goods and services produced by the economy. This buildup of inventory leads manufacturers to cut production. That means they lay off workers. That means that service providers have fewer clients. It's a vicious circle wherein most people's incomes fall. Most economists believe that there is a general business cycle where these events naturally occur. But this instance was much worse and lasted much longer than any economic downturn in American history. And it wasn't just the United States being hit. The economies of Europe plummeted as well. In today's episode, I'm just going to focus on events in the U.S. There were two main segments of the country hit by the Great Depression: agriculture and industry. Let's first deal with agriculture. The farming community was suffering from an economic collapse long before the stock market crash of 1929. American farmers did very well during World War I because so much of the European farmland was out of the marketplace. So American farmers took out loans, purchased more land, more equipment, and produced more and more crops and livestock. But after the Great War, European farms came back. That fact, combined with better farming techniques, and especially the use of tractors and other farm machines, resulted in a giant surplus of crops. All of this extra farm production drove prices down to disastrous levels. What I just described was hitting all of American agriculture, but there was also an area in the U.S. that became known as the Dust Bowl. That was a territory covering parts of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico. It's a flat area with essentially no trees, so there's nothing to break the fierce winds. During the decade of the 1930s, the Dust Bowl region saw precipitation decline between 15 and 25%. Without rain, crops were not growing, and the exposed topsoil was laid bare. The tremendous winds of this area blew away the topsoil, raising billowing clouds of dust called black blizzards. Some of these dust storms were hundreds of miles or kilometers across. Now let's talk about the causes of the Depression in the non-agricultural part of the economy. One of the major causes was the collapse of the stock market. Throughout the 1920s, the stock market kept going up and up and up. Theoretically, stock prices are tied to the value of that particular company. But wild speculation in the 1920s drove up prices that had no relation to the actual worth of that specific corporation. What made matters worse was a practice known as margin buying. Instead of purchasing stock at the agreed upon price, a person could buy stock by putting down as little as 10% of the value. The other 90% of the cost of the stock was loaned to the investor by the stockbroker or a bank. If the stocks went up, the investor could eventually sell that stock, make a profit, and pay off the stockbroker or bank. I'm sure you can see the problem in this setup. What happens when stocks go down? And that's what occurred in October 1929. stock prices plummeted and continued to go down. By mid-November 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had lost almost half of its value. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is a stock market index that tracks 30 large publicly owned blue chip companies. It's considered a good barometer of the broader U.S. economy. Stock prices continued to fall. In the summer of 1932, the Dow Jones Industrial Average closed at 41.22. This was its lowest value of the 20th century and was 89% below its peak value. Following the stock market crash, there were runs on banks as people needed to get cash to pay off their debts for the stock purchased on margin. This led to a contraction in the money supply and widespread bank failures. People who had never had any money in the stock market were now broke because their banks collapsed. As more and more people had no money to purchase goods and services, more and more businesses closed. As more businesses closed and more people lost their jobs, there were less and less people who could purchase goods and services, including agricultural products. I don't think most people today truly grasp how horrible the Great Depression was. Here are some statistics. Gross domestic product fell 50% from 1929 to 1933. Gross domestic product is a comprehensive measure of the total economic activity within a country, representing the total market value of all goods and services produced within the country. Thousands of banks failed. Consumer prices fell 25%. Wholesale prices dropped 32%. Between 1929 and 1933, personal income in the United States declined by 44%. Housing values plummeted. By 1933, 40 to 50% of all mortgages in the U.S. were in default. This led to almost 275,000 home foreclosures in 1933. That was over 4 times the number of home foreclosures which had occurred in 1926. And possibly the most notable statistic, 13 million workers lost their jobs. The unemployment rate when FDR entered the White House in 1933 was 25%. Think about that. 1/4 of the workforce was unemployed. That 25% unemployment rate was even worse than it would be today for 2 reasons. Number 1, there was no unemployment insurance when FDR took office. There was no government safety net in those days. Number 2, in 1933, less than 10% of married women were employed outside the home for wages. That means that the 25% unemployment rate essentially represented 25% of all households losing their income. This was massive unemployment across all walks of life. People in agriculture, manual laborers, factory workers, white-collar workers, and college graduates. What would you do? How do you find a job when your entire industry is shut down? In 1932, a reporter from the Saturday Evening Post asked the most famous economist in the world, John Maynard Keynes, if there had ever been anything like the Great Depression. Keynes replied, yes, it was called the Dark Ages, and it lasted 400 years. Herbert Hoover was president during the first 4 years of the Great Depression, from March 4, 1929 through March 4, 1933. Probably the luckiest president in the history of America was Hoover's predecessor, Calvin Coolidge. He left the White House 7 months before the stock market crash and the start of the Great Depression. Amazingly, some people still think that he was a good president because he reigned over the economic boom times of the 1920s. Some people even call that period Coolidge prosperity. When Herbert Hoover became president in March 1929, He maintained the course and the policies of Coolidge. Yet for some reason, Hoover gets the blame for the Great Depression, but so many Americans do not blame Calvin Coolidge. Look at it this way. If Coolidge had run in 1928, I think every reputable historian believes that Coolidge would have been reelected in a landslide. And I have never read any respected historians who think that the stock market crash and Great Depression would not have begun in the fall of 1929 if Coolidge was still president. So I'm not sure why he gets a pass. Another factor to consider is that the Depression had already hit America's farms while Coolidge was president. Herbert Hoover is a sad story. He was wrongly portrayed at the time as being uncaring. That's not it. He was just in over his head. He was not equipped to deal with this incredible crisis. Hoover did far too little, and the things he did were ineffective and actually made the situation worse. In the last year of his presidency, Hoover created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. That agency provided emergency loans to banks, railroads, and other businesses. Hoover believed that if he helped these big businesses, that they would eventually employ more people. It didn't work. With the exception of the Hoover Dam, a huge project which was passed into law in 1928, Hoover did not fund any large federal public works projects. In the last full year of his presidency, Hoover signed the Revenue Act of 1932, which increased income tax rates from 25% to 63%. These higher taxes crushed what little economic activity there was. The worst thing that Hoover did was enacting the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in June 1930, just 8 months after the stock market crash. A tariff is a tax imposed by a government on goods imported into the country. The cost is paid by the company importing those products and then passed along to the consumers through increased prices. Tariffs directly increase the cost of imported goods, making them more expensive than domestically produced products. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act set high tariffs on a wide range of imported products. The idea by Hoover and the Congress was to protect U.S. agriculture and industry from foreign competitors. If foreign products were more expensive, then people would buy more American products. But that's not what happened. An international trade war occurred almost immediately. Foreign countries slapped high tariffs on American goods. This caused great harm to American agriculture and industry as foreign markets dried up for American products. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff greatly exacerbated the Great Depression. In 1932, the Democrats nominated Franklin Roosevelt for president. At that point, he was the two-term governor of New York. He was stricken with polio in 1921 and was never able to walk again. Amazingly, most people in the country did not realize that he couldn't walk. As part of his acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention, he uttered this phrase:
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. Give me your help not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
The news people picked up on that term, and Roosevelt's program became known as the New Deal. As expected, Roosevelt won in a landslide. He won 42 of the then 48 states. The electoral vote was 472 to 59, and in the popular vote, FDR got 57.4% to 39.6% for Hoover. FDR was inaugurated on March 4, 1933. Fun fact, Franklin Roosevelt was the last president to be inaugurated on March 4. The 20th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified on January 23, 1933. That law changed presidential inauguration day from March 4 to January 20. It also altered the start of congressional terms from March 4 to January 3. Here is the most famous part of FDR's inauguration speech.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
Between the stock market crash in October 1929 and the inauguration of Franklin Roosevelt in March 1933, there were approximately 9,000 bank failures in the United States. There were no credit cards in those days. If you needed something, you paid cash. What would you do in that situation? You lost your job because the factory or business closed, but you had been responsible and had saved money for a rainy day. However, all of your money was in a bank, and the bank is now closed, and you can't get any of your money out. You have no job, and you have no money. How do you pay your rent or mortgage? How do you buy food for your family? By Inauguration Day, 25 of the 48 states had either temporarily closed the banks in their states or had imposed restrictions on withdrawals. This was to stop runs. A run on a bank is when a large number of depositors try to take their money out all at once. This happens because people are afraid that the bank is about to collapse. Banks do not keep enough cash on hand to cover all of the deposits. Most of the money is invested in assets like mortgages or business loans to create income for the bank. On March 6, 1933, President Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday, meaning all of the banks were closed. Roosevelt asked Treasury and Federal Reserve officials from both the new Roosevelt administration as well as the outgoing Hoover administration to meet until they came up with a solution. Those men came up with the Emergency Banking Act, which was passed on March 9, 1933, only 5 days after FDR took office. The new law authorized the Federal Reserve to issue currency to the banks that were reopened. The Treasury Department examined the banks to determine which ones were financially sound. Some banks opened immediately, some opened later on, and some banks were permanently closed. Now that there was a structure in place, the question was, how would the public react? On March 12, 1933, FDR gave the first of his fireside chats. Nowadays, there is so much mass communication that it is often overwhelming. But the president, speaking directly to the American people over the radio, was a new thing. There was no television in those days, and radio was a fairly new phenomenon. Here is part of that broadcast.
It is possible that when the banks resume, a very few people who have not recovered from their fear may again begin withdrawals. Let me make it clear to you that the banks will take care of all needs, except, of course, the hysterical demands of hoarders, and it is my belief that hoarding during the past week has become an exceedingly unfashionable pastime in every part of our nation. It needs no prophet to tell you that when the people find that they can get their money, that they can get it when they want it for all legitimate purposes, the phantom of fear will soon be laid. People will again be glad to have their money where it will be safely taken care of and where they can use it conveniently at any time. I can assure you, my friends, that it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than it is to keep it under the mattress.
The day after Roosevelt's first fireside chat, more money was deposited into banks than withdrawn. The runs on banks had stopped. America's banking system was saved. A few months later, the federal government started guaranteeing people's bank deposits. On June 16, 1933, Roosevelt signed the Banking Act of 1933 into law, creating the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, commonly called the FDIC. According to the FDIC website, since the FDIC's creation, no one has lost a penny of their FDIC-insured deposits. Since 1933, the amount of coverage has steadily increased. Currently, FDIC deposit insurance covers $250,000 per depositor per FDIC-insured bank for each account ownership category. Basically, any savings or checking accounts or certificates of deposit are all covered. The FDIC does not cover financial products and services that are not considered deposits, such as mutual funds, annuities, life insurance, stocks, or bonds. Those two laws in March and June of 1933 truly saved the banking system in this country. There have been problems with banks since that time, but nothing has even come close to the bank failures of the early 1930s. In the approximately first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration, 15 major pieces of legislation were passed. These were incredibly desperate times, and the country wanted action. On May 22, 1932, while running for president, FDR gave an address at Oglethorpe University in Atlanta, wherein he explained his plan. The country needs, and, unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another, but above all, try something. That was the key to Roosevelt's success. Herbert Hoover was afraid to try things. Roosevelt was willing to attempt something which might fail. A perfect example was the National Industrial Recovery Act, commonly known as the NIRA. As explained on the National Archives website, the passage of the NIRA ushered in a unique experiment in U.S. economic history. The NIRA sanctioned, supported, and in some cases enforced an alliance of industries. Antitrust laws were suspended, and companies were required to write industry-wide codes of fair competition that effectively fixed prices and wages, established production quotas, and imposed restrictions on entry of other companies into the alliances. There were some small successes, but overall, it was a bad program. In May 1935, the Supreme Court ruled that the NIRA was unconstitutional. Roosevelt's strength was that he moved on with other programs that were providing a lot more tangible benefits. There were way too many New Deal programs to discuss in one episode, so I'm just going to cover a few of the biggest ones. Let's start with arguably the most successful program under the New Deal. The Civilian Conservation Corps, commonly called the CCC, was a program that was the brainchild of Franklin Roosevelt. The Emergency Conservation Work Act, the law that created the CCC, was passed on March 31, 1933. Even more impressive, the induction of the first CCC enrollee occurred on April 7. That was only 34 days after FDR took office. What was the Civilian Conservation Corps? Men between the ages of 18 and 25 were enrolled to improve America's public lands, forests, and parks. No women were ever registered in the CCC. This was the 1930s. Women had just gotten the right to vote in 1920. The men lived in army-like camps where they worked. They were paid $30 a month, 25 of which would be sent home to their families. They got to keep the remaining $5. The men were provided with housing, meals, and clothes. This program really helped destitute families. Besides the $25 sent to the families, they had one less mouth to feed. Education opportunities were an added bonus. Many young men completed their high school educations while serving in the CCC. Enrollees served 6-month terms. At the end of each term, they could re-enroll for another 6 months, up to a maximum of 2 years. This was a program that was successful in every way. It put people to work almost immediately. According to the National Park Service, over its 9-year lifespan, the CCC employed about 3 million men nationwide. The CCC accomplished great feats, including but not limited to the following: 3,470 fire towers erected, 97,000 miles or 156,000 kilometers of fire roads built, between 4 and 6 million man-days devoted to fighting fires. I've read differing figures. The CCC constructed over 6 million erosion control structures. Erosion was essentially eliminated on more than 20 million acres or 800,000 square meters of land. The CCC cleared 125,000 miles or 200,000 kilometers of trails. Included in the trails was the first downhill ski run or ski trail in the United States. This was located in Stowe, Vermont. Many people credit this first ski run as the creation of the downhill ski industry in the U.S. The CCC also protected range for the grazing service, protected natural habitats for wildlife, improved the flow of rivers and streams, built small dams, and worked on flood relief. Probably the most impressive statistic was the CCC planted more than 2 billion trees. Yeah, you heard correctly. I said 2 billion with a B. 217 million of those over 2 billion trees the CCC planted created a shelter belt to fight the Dust Bowl. That was a non-contiguous line of trees from the Canadian border to Texas to cut down on the winds and to secure the soil. The tree shelter belt, along with soil conservation programs, greatly reduced the Dust Bowl, which finally ended when normal rainfall returned. Some programs of the New Deal did not help blacks or other minorities nearly as much as it helped white Americans. Roosevelt claimed that it was because Congress was dominated by segregationist white senators and representatives from the South, but I think FDR could have worked much harder to assist minorities. I bring this up here because the CCC was one of the New Deal programs that was essentially fair to minorities. Approximately 10% of the enrollees in the Civilian Conservation Corps were black. A few of the camps were even integrated. That may seem like an incredibly low threshold today, but it was a big deal in the 1930s. The Civilian Conservation Corps was ended on June 30, 1942, because of World War II. There's no way to accurately calculate the monetary benefits of the CCC, but it certainly saved millions of dollars in fire prevention, erosion control, and increased land value. Most historians believe that the money saved by these conservation projects far outweighed the costs of the Civilian Conservation Corps. One of the other big successes of the New Deal was the Tennessee Valley Authority, usually just called the TVA, created in 1933. This is not referencing the state. It is named after the Tennessee River, which goes through the states of Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, and eventually flows into the Ohio River. The TVA had several goals. Number one, improve navigation on the Tennessee River. Large portions of the river were blocked to shipping due to rocky shoals, swift currents, and other hazards. The TVA constructed a series of dams and locks, deepened certain parts of the river, and developed port facilities. Because of the TVA, the Tennessee River has a main navigable channel, which, according to the Tennessee Valley Authority website, is 652 miles or 1,049 kilometers long. Boats can now traverse almost the entire Tennessee River from just north of Knoxville, Tennessee, all the way to the Ohio River. Again, according to the Tennessee Valley Authority website, over 28,000 barges carrying 45 to 50 million tons of goods are shipped up and down the Tennessee River annually, and shipping by barge rather than by rail or truck reduces costs by an estimated $400 million each year, reductions that ease prices for consumers. All of this commerce greatly helped develop what had been one of the poorest regions in the United States. The number 2 goal of the TVA was construction of dams to control flooding. The Tennessee River was prone to regular flooding. These floods washed away topsoil from farms and often flooded homes and businesses, as well as killing livestock. The TVA built 9 dams along the Tennessee River to eliminate this regular flooding. According to the TVA website, to date, the operation of this system has prevented over $9.7 billion in flood losses across the Tennessee Valley. The number 3 goal of the TVA: provide cheap electric power in the Tennessee Valley Basin. Although many people in the cities along the Tennessee River, like Knoxville and Chattanooga, had electricity, only 3% of the farms in the Tennessee Valley had electric power before 1933. The TVA continued after World War II and is still in existence today. Because of the TVA, the percentage of farms in the Tennessee River Valley increased from that ridiculous 3% to 97% with electricity by 1959. Benefit number 4 of the TVA: all of the work created thousands of jobs for people who needed them. The lack of electricity on farms was not limited to the Tennessee Valley. It's difficult to imagine today, but when Roosevelt was elected, approximately 90% of farms throughout all of America did not have electricity. Most people who lived in cities and towns had electricity, but only 10% of rural America had electricity in 1932. Can you imagine living like that? As part of the New Deal, FDR signed the Rural Electrification Act on May 20, 1936. This law provided federal loans for the installation of electrical wires and systems in rural areas. It was a huge success. By the end of the 1940s, approximately half of all farms had electricity. By 1953, more than 90% of all American farms had electricity. In 1930, 1/4 of the entire population of the United States lived on farms. Farms accounted for approximately 22% of total employment in America, and approximately 8% of the gross domestic product came from American farms. As I explained earlier, the decline in agriculture happened shortly after World War I, but the problems for farmers got much worse once the Great Depression hit the rest of the economy in late 1929. From 1929 through 1932, gross farm income fell from $12 billion to $5 billion. Between 1913 and 1920, farm foreclosure rates averaged 3.2 foreclosures per 1,000 farms. But by 1926, that rate increased by well over 5 times to 17.4 per 1,000. And by 1933, when Roosevelt took office, it more than doubled again to 38.8 foreclosures per 1,000 farms in America. This was a major crisis which was leading to unrest and even violence in the countryside. In the 1930s, farmers would get together to oppose foreclosures. They would attend foreclosure auctions and bid as low as 1 penny for a farm. They would physically intimidate anybody else who tried to bid on that particular farm. Once the auction was closed, they would turn over the ownership back to the original farmer who had lost the land. Possibly the most famous case occurred on April 27, 1933, with a mob of approximately 200 farmers in Lamar, Iowa. They went to the courthouse and dragged Judge Charles Bradley outside and put a noose around his neck and threatened to hang him if he didn't stop signing foreclosure orders. They did not actually hang him, but the governor of Iowa declared martial law in that county and sent in the National Guard. The first Agricultural Adjustment Act became law on May 12, 1933. In 1936, the Supreme Court ruled the law unconstitutional, so the New Dealers corrected those problems and passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938. The 1938 Act addressed the constitutional issues raised by the Supreme Court, mainly about taxes, and essentially accomplished the same results. Farmers were paid subsidies to decrease the amount of acreage where they were growing crops and to reduce livestock numbers. By reducing the amount of crops and livestock, prices rose. By 1935, the income for American farmers was double from what they were earning in 1932. The New Deal programs, like farm subsidies, injected approximately $2 billion into the agricultural sector. This saved a lot of farmers from starving or losing their lands. A bonus from these New Deal programs was that the acreage that was taken out of use for the staple crops was used to plant grasses as well as implement terracing and contour farming. These were programs to prevent soil erosion. The housing market in the cities and suburbs was also in desperate shape. When people are out of work, they cannot pay their mortgage. As part of the New Deal, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, was established in 1933 to provide low-interest mortgages to both homeowners and private mortgage lenders. Most historians rate the HOLC as one of the great success stories of the New Deal. The New Deal policies overall saved the American dream of owning a house. In Europe, the movement was towards public housing. The New Deal emphasized private home ownership. The Farm Credit Administration and the Homeowners Loan Corporation refinanced 1/5 of all farm and home mortgages. Without the New Deal, the post-World War II housing boom would not have occurred. The HOLC refinanced mortgage loans for approximately 1 million homeowners. Most of these people avoided foreclosure and possible homelessness. Not only individuals, but lenders benefited from this program as well. Lenders were able to trade their delinquent mortgages for HOLC bonds. Some of the New Deal programs cost the federal government a lot of money, but the Homeowners Loan Corporation actually made a profit of $14 million. Now that's a good program. Overall, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was a good thing. After World War II, the HOLC, along with a booming economy and easier financing, resulted in the home ownership rate in the United States reaching 60%. However, the HOLC inadvertently assisted in discriminatory lending practices. The HOLC created color-coded maps of most American cities based upon the risk level of defaulting on a mortgage. The red areas were neighborhoods considered hazardous. These were areas that had low rates of home ownership and deteriorating housing. The problem was the residents in these areas were predominantly black or other minorities. This was the origin of that term, redlining. The federal government was telling private lenders that the redlined areas were undesirable neighborhoods. This made it much harder to get mortgages or any kind of loans. This helped create a cycle of poverty, since money was not available to buy a home or to repair or remodel homes in those districts. Social Security was passed in 1935. A Social Security tax is taken out of a worker's paycheck paid by the employers and the employees. Since it is a government program and not private, Social Security benefits are indexed against inflation and protected from the ups and downs of the economy and financial markets. Although there have been some changes, the basic Social Security system has been in effect for 90 years. It is incredibly popular. It's hard to argue with minimal assistance to the elderly, but some do. There are plenty of people who plan for their retirement but end up destitute in their old age for reasons beyond their control. Maybe they had severe health problems which were not covered by their medical plans. That could easily wipe out somebody's savings. Or maybe they were swindled by a financial advisor or some other fiduciary in charge of their money. Social Security is America's most successful anti-poverty program. Before Social Security, the elderly in the United States had an especially high rate of poverty. 100 years ago, older people tended to live with their children or grandchildren who could support them, but you don't see that today. According to an article on the Princeton University website, Since Social Security was implemented, the number of Americans over the age of 65 that are below the poverty level is just 10%. That is lower than the 12% poverty rate for the U.S. population as a whole. Social Security also helps young people. They do not have to support their parents or have their parents live with them. Both could be big financial burdens. Social Security also helps people under the age of 65 by benefits for long-term disability, along with survivor benefits for dependents of a worker who dies before retirement. I know that there are problems with the Social Security system which need to be worked out, but it's still a good and very popular program. Quoting that same article on the Princeton University website, when a 1981 opinion survey asked how much money out of $100 in Social Security taxes went to administration, the median answer was $52, though the real figure that year was $1.30. Today, Social Security continues to deliver benefits with overhead at a fraction of what private accounts would cost, but few people understand that, in this case, the government enjoys a huge edge in efficiency. Most historians rate the New Deal as a success. More important, the people who lived through the Great Depression viewed it as a good program. I know my grandparents did. So why are there some New Deal haters in America today? A lot of people who criticize the New Deal are just being tribal. And this goes both ways. Republicans hate programs by Democrats, and Democrats hate Republican programs. That is very disingenuous and is certainly intellectually dishonest. I am not a fan of Richard Nixon, but I don't say everything he did was wrong. Nixon actually did some good things when he was president. Two big examples would be establishing diplomatic relations with China in 1972 and creating the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. A perfect example of tribalism regarding the New Deal is the Tennessee Valley Authority. There are people who criticize the TVA for being a giant government project for damming a river and producing cheap electricity. Yet these same people do not criticize the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. The Hoover Dam provides electricity to Arizona, Nevada, and California. It was essentially the same thing as the TVA. The only difference is one party created the Hoover Dam and the other party created the TVA. And again, both parties are guilty of this. One criticism of the New Deal is that Franklin Roosevelt created big government. Of course, it is true that the New Deal greatly expanded the role of the federal government. But here are my responses. Number one, Roosevelt died over 80 years ago. During that time, both parties have controlled Congress and occupied the White House. Have any of them rolled back the federal government to what it was in the 1920s? America and the world have changed since the 1920s. The world is much more complicated, and the United States has changed from being an isolationist and very rural country to a military and economic superpower. The current colossus of the U.S. could not be effectively governed by the small federal government that existed a century ago. Even Ronald Reagan, who ran on a policy of shrinking the government, actually expanded the government. During Reagan's 8 years in office in the 1980s, the federal workforce was increased by approximately 324,000 people to a total of almost 5.3 million. And I know what some of you are thinking, that it was all in the military because he greatly expanded the armed forces. Not true. Uniformed military personnel accounted for only approximately 26% of the increase. I am not saying that this was a bad thing. Reagan was doing what he thought was necessary to save the country from the terrible recession of the late 1970s. I'm only pointing out that the days of small government from 100 years ago are gone for good. Point number two, State and local governments have also grown. Point number 3. Besides being necessary, some of the programs which started in the New Deal are still very popular. 2 examples of current federal programs which started in the New Deal would be Social Security and farm subsidies. Both are very popular. The farm subsidies program has greatly increased. In the year 2000, the federal government distributed a then record $28 billion in direct payments to American farmers. This accounted for nearly 50% of all of the income for the U.S. farmers in that year. In 2020, the federal government paid more than $52 billion, a new record for direct payments to farmers. If you look at the numbers, it doesn't matter if Democrats or Republicans are controlling the White House or Congress. Both parties pay huge amounts to the agricultural community. And it's kind of ironic since the rural parts of the United States tend to be anti-federal government. The most popular criticism of the New Deal is that it did not end the Great Depression. World War II did. I find this argument hilarious. You see articles and books making this argument, but they never think it through to its logical conclusion. It is true that World War II jump-started the economy and set the United States on a period of prosperity that lasted through the 1950s and 60s. World War II ended the Great Depression, but you have to look at why that occurred. It was because of massive government spending. According to data from the University of California, Santa Barbara, the highest annual federal budget during the New Deal was $9.5 billion in 1940. This greatly increased after Pearl Harbor when the U.S. entered World War II. In the last 2 years of the war, 1944 and 1945, the federal budgets were $91.3 billion and $92.7 billion. The federal budgets in World War II were almost 10 times the New Deal budgets. So my question to the people who criticize the New Deal, do you think that Roosevelt should have been spending almost 10 times what he was spending in the 1930s? See, that's the problem when people make a criticism, but they don't follow through on their own argument. The enormous agricultural and industrial output of the United States during World War II ended the Great Depression. U.S. farms and factories were supplying the food, tanks, planes, uniforms, and practically everything else, not just for the American military. Large percentages of these products were sent to America's allies, primarily Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. This was done through the Lend-Lease program, whereby the United States gave food and war equipment to these countries and theoretically would be repaid. Of course, the U.S. was not repaid by our allies. The United States was providing Britain, the USSR, and China the means to keep fighting the Axis powers. The point for today is that the federal government was spending all of this money and not being repaid. So the people who argue that World War II ended the Great Depression in America are arguing in favor of enormous government spending on work projects approximately 10 times larger than anything from the New Deal. Another criticism of the New Deal is that it was ineffective. Here is my main argument in response. The New Deal helped people survive the Great Depression. By 1936, unemployment was reduced to approximately 14%. That was not great, but it was a heck of a lot better than 25%. Although unemployment remained a problem, the New Deal was very effective for making people live through this economic calamity. As Franklin Roosevelt explained, people don't eat in the long run, they eat every day. This was in response to people who said things would be better in the long run, meaning that the federal government should not have gotten involved, and eventually the economy would have turned around. As we saw, it did not completely turn around until World War II. So, If you were one of those people in the 1930s who was out of work, starving, homeless, or about to be homeless, would you think it would be acceptable if you were told, don't worry, in a decade from now, everything will be okay? That would have been a ludicrous position. I am not saying that the federal government could fix all of the problems, but you certainly wanted the government to help as much as it could. The New Deal certainly made things much better between 1933 and 1941 when the U.S. entered World War II. Millions of people were put to work. Millions of people were kept in their homes and kept from starving. That's why the New Deal was wildly popular, as is evidenced by the fact that Roosevelt was elected president 4 times, and in 1936, when he first ran for re-election, he won in one of the biggest landslides in history. He carried 46 of the 48 states. And here's my question to the people who complain about the New Deal. What was the alternative? Doing nothing would have made matters much, much worse. How do we know? Because Herbert Hoover did very little for the first 4 years of the Depression, and the economy continued to spiral downward and hit a low point by the time he left office. The New Deal did not just help individuals. It helped America as a country by saving capitalism. If you want a great definition of irony, read the complaints from some capitalists about the New Deal. They complained then and now about Roosevelt's interference in the American economic system. They ignore the fact that throughout our history, the federal government has interfered in the economy by helping big business. In the 1800s, the federal government granted 174 million acres, or 704,000 square kilometers, of public land to railroads. Before the New Deal, the federal government allowed the timber industry, the mining industry, and the livestock business to use public lands. And the biggest gifts from the federal government were tariffs, implemented to protect American businesses from foreign competition, even though the tariffs raised prices for consumers. So it is ridiculous to argue that the federal government did not interfere with the American economy before the New Deal. Most historians believe that the New Deal saved capitalism. Here are the arguments. Number 1, banks. As I outlined in detail earlier, when Roosevelt was inaugurated, the American banking system was on the verge of complete collapse. Many Americans at that time, including a lot of economists, thought that private banks could no longer work in a modern world. There were a lot of voices urging Roosevelt to nationalize the banking system. He did not do that. Instead, he saved private banks. Number 2, regulation of the stock market. Before the New Deal, Wall Street was the Wild West. There was insider trading and fraud and manipulation, and nobody was monitoring it. There were 2 laws passed to bring fairness and disclosure to the stock market: the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. The New Deal set up the Securities and Exchange Commission, usually just called the SEC. The new laws enforced by the SEC protect investors by requiring companies issuing securities to disclose relevant information and prohibiting fraudulent practices. In America today, even people who do not directly own stocks or bonds are tied to Wall Street because of pension plans and retirement accounts like 401ks. Number 3, Roosevelt helped resist socialist movements. Just about all of the criticism of the New Deal today comes from the political right. What most people don't realize was that, at the time, he was also greatly criticized from the people on the political left. There were people who wanted a complete overhaul of the economy away from capitalism. A lot of Americans flirted with communism and communistic ideas during the Great Depression, with thousands even joining the Communist Party USA. But it might surprise you that there were 2 mainstream efforts to institute very socialist policies. Here are the 2 most famous examples. Upton Sinclair was a writer who exposed social injustices in American society. His most famous work was a book called The Jungle, published in 1906, which exposed the dismal working conditions and unsanitary practices in the Chicago meatpacking industry. The public outcry from The Jungle led to the passage of America's first food safety laws, the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. In the 1920s, Upton Sinclair ran for Congress twice as a member of the Socialist Party. In 1934, he joined the Democratic Party and ran for governor of California. He shocked people by getting the Democratic Party's nomination. Sinclair's program, called End Poverty in California, was detailed in a booklet. Since the initials EPIC spelled EPIC, it was usually just referred to as EPIC. The End Poverty in California plan was essentially this. The state government would take over farms and factories that were sitting idle during the Depression, meaning the ones that were not growing any crops or producing any products. There would be a vast network of collective farm colonies as well as cooperative factories. They would all be run on a production for use basis instead of production for profit. Production for use meant a system where goods and services would be produced directly to meet the needs and desires of individuals in society rather than for profit. The state of California would have a managed cooperative economy that would provide jobs for all and replace the private economy based on profit. You can argue whether that was socialism or communism, but it certainly wasn't capitalism. Upton Sinclair lost the general election to the Republican candidate Frank Merriam, partly because Roosevelt refused to endorse Sinclair even though he was the Democratic nominee, and Roosevelt would not let anybody in his administration publicly support Sinclair either. The other famous socialist policy was a national proposal presented by the controversial and flamboyant senator from Louisiana, Huey Long. His plan was titled Share Our Wealth, but was sometimes known by Long's slogan, Every Man a King. While he was a senator, Huey Long presented this program in a national radio broadcast on February 23, 1934. Here's a general outline of the Share Our Wealth program. Number 1, every family would own a home. Number 2, no family could own more than $3 to $4 million in assets. There would be taxes to limit the amount which any person could earn to $1 million per year and to limit the amount anyone could inherit to $1 million in a lifetime. All surpluses would go to the U.S. Treasury. Number 3, no family could own less than $5,000. Number 4, every family would have an annual income of at least $2,000. Economists have looked into it, and this was not a workable program. But it was becoming very popular across the country. And Huey Long himself was becoming very popular. According to the U.S. Senate website, by the spring of 1935, over 7 million Americans had accepted his invitation to form local Share Our Wealth societies, providing a formidable base for his anticipated presidential bid. In September 1935, Huey Long was assassinated by the son-in-law of a political rival. That was the end for the Share Our Wealth program. I point out these programs from Upton Sinclair and Huey Long because they had a lot of public support. But Franklin Roosevelt stayed clear of both. The millions of people who supported Upton Sinclair and Huey Long were arguing that Roosevelt was too conservative. That's the thing about trying to be a moderate. You get complaints from the far left and the far right of the political spectrum. Some historians argue that FDR may have also saved democracy itself in the United States. Here are the arguments for that position. Roosevelt got the United States through the biggest economic calamity in the country's history with all of our national institutions intact. He never declared martial law. Everything he did was through the framework of the U.S. Constitution and Congress, unlike what was happening in Germany, Spain, and Italy, who turned to fascism. And yes, I'm aware that Benito Mussolini took over in 1922 before the Worldwide Depression. But the conditions were right for the fascist movement in Italy in 1922 because of the horrible economic conditions following World War I. And for those of you who do not think that there could have been a revolution in this country, I would make 2 points. The first was the broad support for the programs I outlined earlier from Upton Sinclair and Huey Long, as well as others I haven't gotten into because of time constraints. The second point is that there were grassroots movements and even some violence because people were starving. I explained to you what was going on in farm areas as they tried to stop foreclosures. There was also the incident of the bonus army. Here's a short summary. The federal government had promised bonuses to World War I veterans, which would be paid in 1945. Due to the Depression in 1932, somewhere between 10,000 and 43,000, I've read various estimates, of veterans and their families went to Washington, D.C. and camped out on public grounds demanding an immediate payment of the World War I bonuses. On July 28, 1932, President Hoover ordered the Army to expel the protesters. General Douglas MacArthur sent in tanks along with soldiers using bayonets and tear gas on unarmed veterans and their families. I am not saying that there would have been a revolution in this country, but people turn to extreme measures when they are starving or homeless. Obviously, we will never know, but I shudder to think what might have happened if Roosevelt essentially told the American people that the federal government was not going to help at all. Good luck with being homeless and starving. You are on your own. Franklin Roosevelt believed in work. Instead of a dole, which means just handing out money, most of the New Deal involved putting people to work. Early on, there were some direct relief payments to people, but most of the money from the New Deal was through work relief programs like I described earlier. Throughout this episode, I have listed a lot of ways that the New Deal made life better for Americans. Here are some random items that did not fit in one of the categories I've already discussed. The Works Progress Administration, which later had a name change to Works Projects Administration, usually just called the WPA, along with other New Deal agencies, built large bridges like the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge and the Whitestone Bridge, the Henry Hudson Bridge, and the Triborough, now known as the Robert F. Kennedy Bridge in New York City. The WPA built the Lincoln Tunnel, which connects Manhattan to New Jersey underneath the Hudson River. The WPA built the first freeway in the United States, originally called the Arroyo Seco Parkway, later known as the Pasadena Freeway, here in Southern California. The New Deal funded the construction or improvement of approximately 800 airports, most notably LaGuardia Airport in New York City. If you've ever been to San Antonio, Texas, the coolest part of the city is known as the Riverwalk. It's a city park that is pedestrian only along both sides of the river with restaurants, shops, and it's just beautiful. That was a New Deal project. The Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River provides electricity and turned arid land in eastern Washington state into farmland, also a New Deal project. The WPA alone put approximately 8.5 million people to work, building more than 4,000 new school buildings, 130 new hospitals, installed 9,000 miles or 14,000 kilometers of storm drains and sewer lines, paved or repaired approximately 280,000 miles or 450,000 kilometers of roads. Besides making life better in the 1930s, these projects had long-term positive effects. These improvements to the infrastructure of America greatly assisted the economic boom after World War II and helped create the country we live in today. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Please tell your friends, relatives, co-workers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. If you are listening on a podcast app which allows ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Reviews really help. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, it's easy to do. Scroll down the History Analyzed show page, select a rating, and then tap Write a Review. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find links to fun items for history geeks. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.